Okay, so hello and welcome to Strategies of Exit, Logics of Escape. This is the third online event for Fixing the Future. My name is Keith Tilford. I'm one of the organizers, along with Diane Bauer, Joshua Johnson, Suhail Malik, and Mohammed Salami. I just want to start off by thanking Jason Adams of the Global Center for Advanced Studies for providing us with some technical support so that we don't crash. And also thank Mo and Joshua for keeping content active on social media and our website related to this event and as well as beyond. So I'd just like to say hello to Strategies of Exit. Somebody needs to mute themselves. Okay, I'd just like to introduce the participants for today. Benedict Singleton is joining us from London, where he's based as a strategist with a background in design and philosophy. Ben writes regularly on the politics and philosophy of technology for publications such as Architectural Design and eFlux. He has been a visiting critic and/or lecturer at the Architectural Association, the Royal College of Art, and the Bartlett School of Architecture. He was a participant in the Incredible Machines Conference organized by Mo at Access Gallery in Vancouver. He was also here in New York last year at Miguel Abreu Gallery in conversation with theoretical biologist and mathematician Giuseppe Longo, as well as Parsons at the New School through the Center of Transformative Media, where I work as a graduate fellow with its director, Ed Keller. And more recently, he has presented his work at the British Interplanetary Society and the Berlin Summer School. His forthcoming book, The Long Con, An Alternative History of Design, will be published with Urbanomic in 2015. We also have with us today Suhail Malik, who's one of the organizers of Fixing the Future. He is currently visiting faculty at CCS Bard New York and co-director of the MFA Fine Arts program at Goldsmiths London, where he holds a readership in critical studies. Suhail recently gave a series of talks at Artispace here in New York last summer entitled On the Necessity of Art's Exit from Contemporary Art. And he has a long list of publications, so I kind of only want to name a few of them. He is a co-editor of Realism, Materialism, Art, and The Flood of Rights, both 2014. The Value of Everything in Text zur Kunst, The Wrong of Contemporary Art, Aesthetics and Political Indeterminacy with Andrea Phillips in Reading Rancière, and as well as You Are Here for Manifest at 8. And just as for myself, I'm an artist and writer, and very briefly in terms of research over the last year, I've been really focused on reading Althusser according to Medic Intelligence through the work of Marcel Detian and Jean-Pierre Verland, as well as Francois Julian, which unsurprisingly owes something to what Ben has been theorizing as generalized escapology, and to him for really introducing me to those other texts. And more recently, I've attempted to synthesize this research with what is being called neo-rationalism and accelerationism in relation to art and a critique of the logics of contemporary art. So this sort of like runs right into Suhail's project. So instead of reciting the abstract for today's event, I could just say that the idea for it really emerged from this out of the recognition that the three of us are all very concerned with finding a way out of present conditions and how thinking the future really becomes an imperative within the conditions of the present. And where there might seem to be a sort of dissent, has been for one working on a generalized escapology in favor of design without any real concern for art, which does not in itself possess the sort of protracted capacities of design. Suhail advocating a strategy of exit from contemporary art against the logic of escape, etc. There's still the sort of question about what the differences between how exit and escape are being thought here, and what are the major differences between art and design, how do they sort of fold into each other and start to share the same neighborhoods, and then how do these problems start to have broader consequences beyond merely their localization with one or another discipline or practice. So my wager at least is that there would be more of an alignment between our respective positions than might appear on sort of superficial examination. So that's kind of the brief of why I wanted to organize today's event. And in terms of the structure for today, Ben is going to present first, then I will follow and attempt to sort of extend some of the consequences for art or artistic practices based on some of what I mentioned. Then Suhail will present, and we'll follow that up with a discussion, at which point we're going to try to open the Google Hangout to anyone who might be watching live and might have a question they want to pose live, which if that is the case, because this is a Google Hangout, you would need to be logged in either to Google Plus or through Gmail. But there's also a place to post questions on the YouTube link itself, or they can be posted on Fixing the Future Facebook page for this event, and we'll try to sort through them and pose them to whomever it might be addressed to during that time. So I guess that said, I'm just going to hand things over to Ben. Ben, are you there? I think Jason has to unmute you or something.
Hello? Yeah, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Could I be unmuted? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, well, firstly, thanks very much to Keith for inviting me to take part, and for the other organisers as well for putting this on. As Keith was saying, I'm a strategist based in London, and my kind of professional background is in design, and then kind of increasingly philosophy. So Keith asked me to sort of talk about traps mostly and escape, and this was something that I first started looking at, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago, when I was doing a PhD at the design school at the University of Northumbria. And so to kind of like elaborate what I was looking at in the first place, you know, having a background in design. Sorry, I think someone's unmuted. I can hear an echo. No, I think it might be you. Okay. Yeah, so the reason I started looking at traps is because I have a kind of professional and more immediately a practical interest in how things get done, basically, in efficacy and actually making changes to the world, and the various related concerns that spring from that, like the limits of planning, the ability to sort of have an effect on a situation which can be, in the most immediate sense, kind of ambiguous and intractable, and so on. And this is just the sort of job lot of anyone who works actually, you know, trying to build things, I think. So while I was doing research on this, motivated, I should say, mostly by kind of those immediate questions, but also the fact that there's a terrible kind of paucity to the philosophy of technology. There really is, considering how densely textured our world has become with artifice. Philosophies of technology, histories of technology, and so on tend to be really quite restricted, disproportionately so, some might say. Anyway, I first came across kind of the logic of the trap when I was doing research into like potential other ways of looking at design and understanding the kind of principles that were operative in it and what potentials they might have. So the trap ended up becoming a singularly important class of object in those early investigations. They're not obviously a kind of ubiquitous phenomenon in everyday life, and we don't encounter traps in the most immediate sense of things like hunting traps on a daily basis. They tend to be hidden away in the margins where the pests thrive and so on. But looking at the kind of long history of design back through the Western tradition of writing about artifacts, and also various non-Western traditions as well, which I'll maybe touch on a little bit later, the trap repeatedly returned as a particular class of object that had a strange kind of significance to it, because it embodies a particular form of intelligence and understanding of construction that is highly unusual, and when it is mentioned at all, is often seen as dangerous when people have tried to conceptually unpack what's at stake in a trap. I mean, this goes, you know, a good indication of this is back 350 BC or so, And Plato, in the 8th book of the Laws, pens a series of passages saying that the trap should be banned from the perfect society. Hunting traps, I mean, so traps and snares and pits and other such things. And the reasoning that he gives is that by teaching people to make traps, you will end up fomenting political revolution and people pushing things out of, the ordained place in the particular kind of utopia that he was describing. He's remarkably explicit about this. I mean, he says that, that literally by teaching people to create nets for fishing and so on, you will instigate a regime of piracy eventually. And that by teaching people to catch birds in the wild with various forms of snare and fouling and so on, you will end up producing bandits who will overrun the hills and this kind of thing. All of which was very intriguing. And so I hope over the next sort of 15 minutes or so to understand what the logic that was identified there, one which Plato himself doesn't really specify, but which, as I say, has been recurrent in various kind of minor texts which have dealt directly with traps in both the Western tradition and outside of it. So when we're talking about a trap, they're kind of intriguing objects already, just in their very kind of instantiation. I mean, the trap actually, it runs off intrigue, if you see what I mean. That fascination is kind of part of its active mechanism. A trap is there to actively kind of solicit interest and engagement in a kind of deceptive way. When you think about how a trap actually works, and this is relayed in, for instance, various trickster legends about the origins of the trap, which is usually laid at the foot of the trickster. The trap kind of contours an environment and utilizes propensities in behavior of creatures in the environment against their own interests. Bait, in particular, is a kind of means of producing a sort of behavioral gradient, a kind of attractive gradient that that structures the environment in a highly particular way, which is associated with all kinds of things aesthetically and duplicity and so on. I mean, the story is often told in trickster legends and so on that basically the origin of the trap, this is a mythic understanding, not a historical one, of course, but the origins of the trap come when the trickster, who is kind of rootless and not at home in any particular environment, has some small amount of food in unfamiliar terrain and doesn't know how, and knows that that amount of food is not going to satisfy them, but then in a remarkable moment of kind of insight, realizes that other creatures would make a fine meal of that food, and in doing so creates the concept of bait and lays a trap and basically rather than trying to chase other creatures, brings them to him. It's usually him, but not always, of course. So this is a moment of, as a sort of productive moment, the intelligence that is at work here is a form of empathy, but shorn of any associations with sentimentality, really, or attachment in general. And the trap, the mode of empathy at work in the trap produces not fellowship, but a kind of complicity. It's the product of modeling the environment and the tendencies found within it, expresses the detection of points of vulnerability and the induction of error as a generative principle. So what does this have to do with design? I mean, clearly the design of traps can be dangerous things themselves, but certainly in Plato's work and in other accounts of the trap, minimal as they may be, the trap has often been associated with this particular kind of intelligence, which is constructive, or productive, perhaps is another word, but not in the way that usually, at least in the Western tradition, is usually taken up. It doesn't rely on producing a kind of plan with a detailed image of the future and then the instantiation of that on the world considered as a passive substrate, but rather the kind of active solicitation of effects. And certainly, Keith's already mentioned them, but one of the few places where this is treated with any length is in a book called Cunning Intelligence in Greek Culture and Society by Marcel Détienne and Jean-Pierre Benon, when they talk about the kind of intelligence embodied in the trap in ancient Greece being understood as metis, which roughly translates as the cunning intelligence of the title. And this is a form of intelligence that is in operation whenever the world appears to be highly ambiguous, resistant to easy purchase, confusing, ambivalent, and so on. Basically, any kind of frontier space where the general rules of conduct no longer apply. And as such, it links the construction of the trap with various other interesting kinds of operations, like the deployment of daring military stratagems with courtly or otherwise political intrigues, with the ability of entrepreneurs to produce money seemingly from nowhere, and also from artisanship, which may seem initially a kind of obscure connection. But what the means of that connection, the mode of that connection, is a recognition that when you actually create some kind of new structure in an artifactual sense, or piece together some kind of system out of the world, you necessarily do that by exploiting the tendencies or propensities which are already found in the environment. And this yields a view of constructive activity which, as I say, is rather different from one which is based on the idea of like drawing up a plan and then just kind of implementing it straightforwardly. Instead of that, it's something which is more active, vigilant, exploratory, and manipulative. And this form of intelligence is one which is kind of much maligned in Western theory, being highly contextual and, as I say, dangerous and subversive, as Plato kind of recognized. It's a form of intelligence which basically is a weapon of the weak, which is a fairly dramatic reinterpretation of design away from its associations with things like instrumental reason and the project of dominating environments to something which is far more kind of insidious, subtle, and in certain senses revolutionary. So the trap then becomes a kind of image of a particular way of being in the world, which is associated with weakness and vulnerability, but also with active projects to try and manipulate the world in ways that are preferable, but in a way that strikes us now as being remarkably new. Metis itself as a term is just one kind of formulation of general observations about the structure of this kind of intelligence. There are many other, in the early modern period in the West, you have Machiavelli, or you have Giambattista Vico in his book on acumen. I guess more recently you have Francois Julien's studies of efficacy in ancient Chinese philosophy, the Han Fei, the BBC, and so on. There's the Arthur Strasser of the 3rd or 4th century before the Christian era in India. Similar kind of observations are made specifically with respect to craft in the kind of global anthropological work of Mary W. Helms and so on. So there's really that kind of work that I was doing a few years ago was an attempt to sort of synthesize these things together and think about, well, what is the value of considering this form of intelligence? How does it work? And how does it relate to constructive projects at their most general? So, well, I've been talking for sort of 10 minutes or so already, and I just want to kind of finish up before I hand over to Keith by talking about some of the ways in which this is kind of like spilling out into the book that Keith mentioned that I was writing, which hopefully will be out next year, depending on whether I'm able to actually pull it together from its current state. This is, I guess, one of the central themes of the book as it relates to traps is the idea of ambition and what success is and how we're able to conceive that in new and hopefully provocative ways. So the kind of intelligence we were talking about that is implicit in the setting of traps is a sort of eminently tactical and local kind of operation. It deals with the situation that it immediately finds itself in and sets about its operations in a particularly kind of improvisational and ingenious way, at least when it works. And I became very interested in what does this mean in terms of, like, how can this be upscaled? How can it be extended? How can this be turned into something which has a more of a global reach? And why would that be interesting? Well, first the question why it's interesting is because this kind of intelligence is extremely deeply involved, not just with setting traps, but also escaping from them. This is a really common theme in writing about traps, as I say, where it does appear that the same kind of intelligence is at work in the setting of traps as being able to extricate oneself from them. This is perhaps a initially kind of strange assertion to make, but it relates to an understanding of the world as what Detienne and Venant at one point call a world of snares, that we, as individual agents, however you want to see us, are constantly surrounded by all kinds of traps which give structure to our behavior. And the creative acts in general tend to involve diffusing those in order to make something new possible. This is not a simple and straightforward kind of liberatory venture, however. One of the fundamental things I think that has an import of this view of constructive activity is that in order to escape a trap, you have to recognize yourself as being part of it. In the 17th century French colonies, the slaves, I am told, had a particular name for the project of escape, which is stealing one's own corpse. And by this it was meant that in order to actually escape from the situation that you were in, you had to understand yourself as being complicit in the logic of it, that you were being trapped, but you were being actively solicited within that project of entrapment. And that it was only by kind of objectifying yourself and understanding yourself as a part of that mechanism that you were able to diffuse it or to disarm it long enough to get away. So there's a certain sense of freedom which comes from that, which is produced by that take on the world, which is a freedom not from alienation but through alienation, a project of kind of detachment, which I think has also some relations to kind of Stoical philosophy and so on. This particular kind of project of escape is a cumulative one then, if we exist in a world of traps, such that on freeing ourselves from when an intelligence frees itself from one situation by finding some way to negotiate the traps which put it into that situation and keep it there, you are not confronted with some kind of like immediate finish line, but rather a sort of quantitative stepwise project of decoupling oneself from the next round of traps in which you find yourself, and the round of traps after that, and after that, and after that, and after that. So you have a kind of stepwise understanding of freedom, which is continual and progressive, but which has no kind of imminent finish line already sort of inscribed into it. There's no final state of actual liberty. And this is not least because in order to actually continue that trajectory and continue undoing traps as intelligence finds itself embroiled in, it's necessary also to produce kind of new traps for itself, new ways to contort or contour behavior such that that project continues. Is reminiscent of some writing by one of my favorite writers on strategy, Thomas Schelling, who worked in the White House in the 1950s, 1960s, who wrote some fascinating things on the idea of like, well, how do you actually kind of like ensure your kind of continued freedom? And well, you have to consider your future self as a potential enemy who needs to be subject to traps that you deploy, and your future self may go back on the things that you have done. So therefore, can you configure environments in order to make your future self do what it is you want? So a kind of adversarial position towards yourself. There are all kinds of strange and counterintuitive dimensions of a project such as this, which I think is a kind of like global reformatting of what we understand to be the basic kind of relations between conditions of freedom and constructive projects themselves. So this is what I called in an essay published in its sort of prototypical form last year, under the title Maximum Jailbreak, which a longer version of which ended up in the Accelerationist Reader. In there I described this as an understanding of design as a kind of generalized escapology, a sort of expertise and traps which related both to the project of entrapment of various things, including yourself, and also escape, coupled such that the progressive kind of increase intelligence of an actor is really dependent on their ability to negotiate this continual cycling of the trap and escape from it, and the trap and escape from it, and so on, in such a way that a gradient is opened up and more options become continually available to behavior. It's not a point of view which is readily reconcilable, I think, with many kind of existing understandings of liberty, which are based on the project of describing a kind of hallowed state of final freedom, that this is what the world will look like when we are finally free, but rather something which is piecemeal and progresses over time, building up little local hustles into longer and longer cons. And on that note, I think I will hand over to Keith, who I think has some very interesting things to say about this in terms of its relationship to art and Althusser and various other people. So, Keith, over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. All right.
Yep.
So, one of the initial ideas that we had as a group when sort of planning these online seminars was to each devote a sort of event to address one of the recommended readings that we have on the website. And my initial thought was to take Peter Osborne's Anywhere and Not at All, Philosophy of Contemporary Art, but I thought that it would be better to just sort of abbreviate an analysis and overview of that work and sort of fold it into this event. And I should just add that it's on the website at my request, simply because I think that outside of Suhail's project, it's really like the only rigorous attempt at sort of reckoning with what gets called contemporary art. And it's a significant attempt at a diagnosis, at least. And I know Suhail has already provided commentary on Osborne's work in the second of his series of talks that he gave at Artist Space last July, but I'm sort of interested in isolating some aspects of Osborne's work that he might not have addressed, which will sort of allow me to engage in his own critical project and hopefully provide a few provocations there. So there's going to be some overlap in what I say about Osborne's text, and I'm sort of also aware that, like, what I'm excising from his text might seem to be like the most obvious descriptions of contemporary, but it's kind of like motivated by this idea of Althusser's that, there's nothing more difficult to get around or break through than what's actually obvious, what sort of like appears to be given. So, with Osborne's text, a sort of foundation of the entire book rests upon this claim that contemporary art is a post-conceptual art, and it takes him roughly 50 pages to sort of come up with a reasonably concise account of what he means by this. And he says, quote, "By a post-conceptual art, then, I understand an art premised on the complex historical experience and critical legacy of conceptual art, broadly construed, which registers its fundamental mutation of the ontology of the artwork. Post-conceptual art is a critical category that is constituted at the level of the historical ontology of the artwork. It is not a traditional art historical or art critical concept at the level of medium, form, or style. Rather, as the critical register of the historical destruction of the ontological significance of such categories, it provides new interpretive conditions for analysis of individual works," end quote. And just to say that what Osborne means here by ontology is any discourse about forms or modes of being, and he kind of sort of consigns that to an endnote, and I'm not going to worry about being irritated by his refusal of a distinction between a fundamental ontology and the ontic. I think somebody else can do with that. And like what he means, by saying the mutation of the ontology of the work has sort of precipitated this reception of works in the present as enigmatic, opaque, resistant to interpretation. Yet this in itself is deemed to be somehow productive in the sense that it introduced like a kind of multiplied and destabilized material for new theoretical or critical interpretation. And I think you can kind of see Adorno rearing up here because, he insisted in his aesthetics theory that, art has no obligation to communicate and it's philosophy's responsibility to do so. In fact, like all of aesthetic theory I see is sort of constructed and engineered around that tension, and probably in a much more interesting way than Osborne's text would be. And for Osborne, the contemporary of post-conceptual art's temporality is a disjunctive unity of present time. So the contemporary is said to exist as a unity whose togetherness forms a kind of fiction, or what he will refer to as a fictive relational unity of the historical present. Moreover, he insisted as an operational fiction, regulating the disjunction between the past and future through recognitions and projections of multiple forms of contemporaneity, which themselves are becoming increasingly contracted and index the future only as a kind of vague Kantian infinite task whose distribution is necessarily incomplete spatially as well as temporally. So the contemporary establishes itself artificially as a necessarily geopolitical fiction because when the present begins depends on where one is geopolitically. This would also mean that a work of art inserted into this logic can be manipulated through a potentially unlimited distribution within these whens and wheres, providing it with a retroactive ontology, i.e. future iterations in spaces and places forming kind of afterlife for the artwork as it moves through different presents. And these are new historical conditions according to Osborne, and based on that logic, they must be perceived as a sort of necessarily antagonistic relation between times and spaces across a global context where contemporary art is said to position itself as a free movement. Yet this movement remains mediated by the movements of capital, which themselves are largely responsible for providing art with this sort of like false or inflated sense of autonomy. And Osborne will say only parenthetically that within this global context, quote, art is a kind of passport. In the new transnational spaces, it figures a market utopia of free movement, while in actuality it embodies the contradiction of the mediation of this movement by capital, end quote. The disjunctive unity of contemporary art, i.e. logics abiding by an artificial or fictive unification through the indifferent collaging of multiple temporalities, collage also being the procedure which is sort of de facto indifferent to its materials, is agitated continuously by the generalized movements of capital, which already break down existing categories, thus exacerbating contemporary art's generic post-medium vector in the multiplicity of circuits through which art today is moved and the diversity of spaces and places within which it is staged as it combines institutional bureaucracy with curatorial, critical, philosophical, and financial manipulation. So even while art inhabits a system, capitalism, the properties and logics of contemporary art as opposed to conceptual art are anti-systemic, since one of conceptual art's original moves was to undermine a previously existing state of the arts as a system of arts, such that contemporary art is an evasion of system in favor of the affirmation of multiplicity and difference, where the term post-conceptual acts as a kind of condensation and reflection of its destruction of previous attempts at systematic construction or engagement with the logic of systems, and it forces an incomplete condensation. So it's an incomplete unification of a multiplicity of different strata of time. So different anticipations, sedimentations, different excavations and rearticulations of different historical trajectories, different relations of different reflections on local geopolitical histories, etc. So this leads Osborne to contend that works of contemporary art as fragments of time rather than completed works align themselves with the open-ended process of iteration, or in the free-for-all site of the project space, where contemporary art sort of affirms itself via the modernist work in progress come project. And he turns to Schlegel again here, where project is sort of the name given to the work that it exists as a fragment of the future, albeit in an extremely indeterminate future. And I could sort of imagine Reza Negarestani to be saying something like, concerning contemporary art, that its totalizing logic is really an overextension of its powers and its significance, and especially an overextension of its conceptual resources that would be on par with that of something like vitalism or panpsychism. And in fact, like contemporary art's logic and vitalism are extremely entangled. So the anti-systematicity of contemporary art's logic qua affirmation of difference mean that system reappears only negatively as an idea. So system is what the works, or at the very least the interpretation of works, react against in order to affirm the ambiguity of the artwork in relation to the multiplicity of singular experiences through iterations in different spaces and times. And a kind of symptom of this is what Suhal has referred to as the ubiquity of the senses, which we could say is precipitated by what Osborne refers to as the potential infinity of disparate actualizations. Yet disparate actualizations are also the real tension of the multiple crises of modernity, which are also interpreted by Osborne as crises of time, such that art is said to exist embryonically, and according to Osborne, it, quote, inhabits the space of the crisis of mediations, which is at the same time that of the production of new, more complicated, negatively mediating forms, mediations of the crisis of mediations. And as concerns contemporary art, these mediations are iteration, isms, series, etc. But this also means, although Osborne does not exactly say this himself, that for contemporary art, neither a determinable future nor the manipulable properties of a system are permitted to emerge as horizons and material conditions for artistic practice. In fact, horizon itself disappears because in its place there's only the power of Capel's horizons of expectation. So, and this is kind of how Osborne, like rather sadly, I think, concludes the book. He says, quote, "We will not reclaim a future qualitatively different from the present by reinvesting in the idea of horizon. At its best, contemporary art models experimental practices of negation that puncture horizons of expectation," end quote. So the interpretive conditions of post-conceptual art that Osborne sets up are themselves only operative to the extent that horizons remain absent from art's investments, which are turned over to the financial investment in art. Yet if horizons are foreclosed, then futures are foreclosed also, and we arrive at a kind of paradox, since how can any kind of future even become part of a project itself posed as a fragment of the future in the absence of horizons? So any capacity of art to meddle with and puncture these existing horizons is not enough to provide it with any kind of real efficacy. And I would sort of argue that it's exactly through the reinvestment in the idea of the horizon that art needs to sort of proceed in the present. So if a first step in this direction is not to adopt what Suhal has called the anarcho-realist maxim, that would always seek an outside from existing art, an ideal, more real art that it continues to seek and lay claim to despite its own recapture by institutions. And anarcho-realism being defined by Suhal as the negation of the incorporation of negation in art. And I sort of leave it to anyone watching to go and watch also Suhal's third talk on the history of negations to see just how convoluted this can kind of get. So what's suggested is art's claim to autonomy needs to be rejected, and it should be apprehended as an institutional practice. Since as real is in fact, as Suhal put it, its institutionality, which as such indexes its artificiality, its vulnerability, and therefore its changeability. So the move suggested is to, Suhal again, quote, negate post-negationary art without recourse to an idealized art, end quote. So art's institutionality is its unidealized real, because this institutionality is part of the material conditions of practice. Discourse, display, financial and curatorial manipulation, or other operations of power, etc. So be it, right? But if this is the to be desired alternative, i.e. to treat art at the level of its artificiality, inauthenticity, and institutionality, and in place of the idealized external real art, and if this also indexes art's changeability, then we're going to change the scene at this point. I think Althusser actually sort of provides an extremely useful and indispensable way of thinking through the ramifications of Ben's idea of generalized escapology, since this was precisely his project. It was a destabilization from within that did not seek an external position from which to make its modifications. So there's no anarcho-realism. And Etienne Balibar has sort of described this in a recent presentation that he gave at the New School last year on the dramatization of ideology in Althusser's work, so that from the perspective of a project like Althusser's that was aimed at destabilizing Marxism from within, there could be no such thing as anarchic freedom. You only can transit among sort of different modalities of ideological determination. And this is something that Althusser himself explains, but only really in a letter in 1986 to Fernando Navarro. And he sort of only makes sense in his letters, oddly. And it's a long quote, but I want to read it all because I think it sort of helps to sort of place this. So Althusser says, quote, "The interpolation of the individual as subject, which makes him an ideological subject, is realized not on the basis of a single ideology, but of several ideologies at once, under which the individual lives and acts as practice. These ideologies may be very local, such as his subject in his family and at work, in his immediate relations with his family and friends or his peers, or they may be broader, local in the broad sense, either regional or national. Such ideologies are, for the most part, always initially inherited from the past, the tradition. What results is a play in a space of multiple interpolations in which the subject is caught up, but which, as contradictory play as space, constitutes the freedom of the individual subject, who is simultaneously interpolated by several ideologies that are neither of the same kind nor at the same level. This multiplicity explains the free development of the positions adopted by the subject individual. Thus, the individual has at his disposal a play of maneuver between several positions, between which he can develop, or even if you insist, choose, determine his course, although this determination is itself determined, but in the play of the plurality of interpolations. End quote. So, even if this read like Osborne's idea of distributive unity as the, quote, logical form of the historical unity of the empirical forms, Osborne there, or that which in the Althusserian terms Osborne actually deployed, structured in dominance by dominant forms. What seems crucial here is that Althusser's description here of subjection in terms of the simultaneity of the multiplicity or plurality of ideological interpolations can be read according to the systematicity of nested hierarchies of ideological stratas through which the agency of subjects is determined, and by way of which agency sort of carves out a regional autonomy that is not that of an illusionary autonomy that would index some externality that would be more real than the determination that it inhabits, since its reality only has meaning in and through the internal constitution of its capacities within the process of determination itself. And Althusser sort of insists on this point that these determinations are non-deterministic, so they're manipulable. So in relation to this kind of interiority, what Althusser describes in Reading Capital is philosophy's own problem with attempts to sort of posit an outside that still belongs to its interiority, would also seem to describe the problem with experimental practices of negation within contemporary art. So stepping outside becomes an idealism, an escapism, and Ben really also makes this point in his Maximum Jailbreak piece, where he says, you know, in order to be free of the trap, it's of less use of the trap to decide upon some holy condition of freedom than to understand how one is implicated in the mechanism of one's entrapment. To engage in the former is mere escapism. That's been there. So the necessity to exit contemporary art seems to sort of invert towards an entry into the dimension of art's capture. So it's a decision to kind of inhabit the trap, as it were, and to change art is to sort of appropriate an understanding of this entrapment. And, you know, it's the escape without final escape to an outside, put it like that or something. And we could attempt to actually put this in the Althusserian terms such that the problem of a more real art exists outside of existing art is the artificial problem manufactured by contemporary art as both its theoretical mirror and practical justification. The real, non-artificial problem is rather that of art's artificiality. And I sort of like came up with that at like 2 a.m., so I need to actually think if it's going to hold, but it seems to sort of make sense in, you know, in relation to what Suhala has been saying. So, you know, Warren Montag in Althusser and His Contemporaries, which is like a really brilliant monograph on Althusser's work, sort of paraphrases the relevant passage here that appears in Reading Capital. And Montag says, quote, "To imagine that it's possible to wage a struggle from the outside when there exists no outside, except an outside already inscribed within a given field as its outside, is thus to take up a position already inscribed within as a function of the order one would overturn. In this sense, one must operate necessarily from the interior, and the manner in which one inhabits this interior determines whether one can undermine and destabilize the conceptual order. To imagine the possibility of simply stepping outside, or as Althusser put it, of finding an empty corner of the forest, is to be condemned to repeat the very discourse with which one would break," end quote. So we could say that the maxim of anarcho-realism here, which precisely posits itself in this non-existent empty place, does not exactly follow a logic of escape, but it's rather that of escapism, which, you know, has to be distinguished from the kind of escapology that I think, you know, Ben Singleton is elaborating. And it seems to me that the notion of exiting contemporary art, at least as Suhala has described, is actually more compatible with an escapology than some sort of notional exit. So this was part of an initial question when sort of returning to Althusser's text after being introduced by Ben to the concept of metic intelligence. So how can inhabiting the interior in Althusser's sense be read according to Metis and in terms of inhabiting the trap? And the figures of Metis described by Detienne and Varnant, like those of the bond, the circle, and the reversal, which are the three main sort of figures, actually appear throughout all of Althusser's work, from from the bond or grip of ideology on subject individual to the grasping of concept and the mechanism of appropriation, to the circle of discourse, which is itself figured as a bond, to the reversal of interpolation as counter-interpolation. So in considering all that makes up metis as a mental category, ruses, traps, tricks, riddles, the modeling of the predator's intelligence based on that of its prey, it's consistent with his conception of philosophy, since for him philosophy proceeds by way of tricks. It's also the sort of perpetuation of the Kantian Kampfplatz, or battlefield, where every position that one would occupy is already occupied by one's enemy, such that the advancements of a theoretical position is understood as an encroachment gained upon the enemy. It therefore must take up and design their position in thought, in theory, and in practice, in theoretical practice. So this is really what, for Althusser, is philosophy as theoretical practice figured through the tactical deployment of specific ruses. And this is also, of course, a sort of main complaint against Althusser, especially by Rancière in his first book, Althusser's Lessons, the deceptive philosopher speaking only to the clever reader. But I think that instead of taking note of this just primarily negatively, it makes much more sense, and this is my wager at least, to examine his methodology according to Metis, since just as for Althusser, psychoanalysis could only proceed by way of ruses in order to gain access to the subject's encrypted traumas. Philosophy had to make use of ruses as a means to transform social practices by sort of destabilizing and modifying the conceptual matrix that they were caught up in, as in a net. Yet, the imperative of the materialist position with which to do this was also thought by Althusser to be a trap, because it was the index of an exigency to remove thought to break free from idealism, but it was unable to do so, since according to him, most materialisms actually ended up being inverted idealisms, or could at least become so. So the outside to which one might escape is actually closer to the outside described by the analysis of Foucault. I mean, his former student, after all. It's an interior externality, so it's the outside of the inside. It's that which is a part of the interior which isn't recognized from within. It effectively becomes its outside, because the visibilities of the structure function according to the invisibilities or exclusions. So what happens on this inside, this interiority, then, if one is to inhabit the interior in terms of practice? For Althusser, like, the only possible empty place, was kind of this political gesture figured as a minimal internal distance, which was nothing more than a separation. It was like the mere fact of being divided, as he put it in Lenin and Philosophy. So it also seems significant that one of the only sort of gestures toward a theory of counter-interpolation that might actually be found is through his reading of Brecht, and specifically in his notes on a materialist theater. And Balibar actually prefers to see Althusser as a kind of stage director in philosophy rather than an author. Sort of claim that he hated authorship more than Foucault or something. And the effect of estrangement that would compel one to turn around and face the backstage, which would be the real conditions of one's existence, of taking leave of the play, simultaneously produces another backstage, another behind the scenes. So it's what takes hold of the scene one is witness to, what determines and orients its action through a kind of ruse of reason. The plots just sort of proliferate in this way, and these are the kind of contours of theoretical practice based on this idea of an internal distance or separation from the totality of conditions. So it's kind of like Althusser turns subjection into a platform based on at least thinking of platforms in the way that Ben has sort of been working with them. So if Althusser bases these ideas of counter-interpolation on theater, he sort of performs a similar move with the ideological effect of art, where art is said to also produce a kind of separation. It has an effect on ideological configuration, effects on knowledge, or knowledge effects, since it does not in a strict sense produce knowledge. And for him, knowledge in the strict sense was allocated to the sciences alone. So both art and science are, have a kind of specific relationship for him, and they're said to be in ideology, but not of it. So art gets inserted into ideological circuits, as he put it. And this is all supposedly managed by its its capacity to sort of like produce as an object this internal distance. And you see a variation of this logic in Badiou's theory of the subject, or in his more recent works as subtraction or distance from the state. However, Bruno Bastilles has suggested recently in his brief essay entitled "Some Highly Speculative Remarks on Art and Ideology" that was written for Documenta 13, that ideology today actually functions more like art itself. So such the gap that this minimal distance or difference opened by art in the sensorium is kind of, as he puts it, quote, the quintessential model for the ideological inscription of individuals into the existing social structure, end quote. And he proceeds to say, following an example that he actually borrows from Lyotard, quote, the internal differentiation of art from the usual ideological meanings of human activity is exactly the way in which critics, curators, and philosophers enter the game. The result is an irrefutable win-win situation in which the more a work of art subtracts itself from all meaningful interpretation, the more we can be sure of the success, if not of the maker, then at least of the interpreter. So as a, end quote, and as a result, it's like, sort of leads to this undecidability of works, or their ambiguity or opacity, assumed as productive in this case, for someone at least. And Bastils also proceeds to suggest that this differentiation or internal distance, quote, could also provide us with the false assurance of not being part of the game, all the while serving as a guarantee for our obeying its every rule, end quote. But if, this figuring of sort of internal distance is not the same as a notional exit, what distinctions or alignments can be made between the former thought in terms of an ideological effect or a knowledge effect, a kind of confusion or effect of the system, and what Reza Negarestani has pursued in terms of the designated instability or regional puncture within a generic landscape, which, according to Reza, provide an epistemic cue by interweaving contingency and continuity among different layers of mediation. So, and since what is a work of art's ambition, other than to be some X placed in a generic landscape, alien to the given surrounded, that enables thinking to sort of gain traction on an artistic, political, or epistemic configuration. To the very least, think otherwise than as conditioned. And you, of course, have to assume that, an ambition for art beyond being just expensive furniture. So this is also a question of the antagonism between negationary and functionalist practices, since on the one hand you have the puncturing of existing horizons of expectation, absent of any investment in horizon. On the other hand, you have this regional puncture that establishes horizons. So the verbiage is similar, but the entailments are, I think, entirely distinct, given that the former, experimental practices of negation, is premised on the rejection of functionalist integrations. And the communization theory of endnotes, for instance, which can certainly be figured as an experimental practice of negation, directly rejects functionalism. They did it specifically in any Althusserian Marxism in their article, Crisis in the Class Relation. The Althusser himself rejected accusations of functionalism. It's probably a different story. But Gracier, when he was analyzing the works of endnotes in his article, Wandering Abstraction, I think describes the consequences of this perfectly. Gracier says, quote, the abstract negation of functional context is also the negation of emancipatory possibilities whose release depends upon the recontextualization of function. Such abstraction indetermines instead of determining the fusion of cognitive and practical orientation required for the realization of communism. It abolishes the capitalist present at the cost of canceling the post-capitalist future locked up within it, end quote. So a refusal of functional context is also a refusal of systems and artifice. It's dressed up as an experimental practice of negation in contemporary art, and it's as much as anarcho-realism as that of communization, which might as well fall into the category of what Althusser called the bad subjects. And in Balibar's estimation, these bad subjects who insist on sort of anarchic freedoms remain the ones trapped worst of all. This is not to say that situations don't exist where these kinds of perverse refusals aren't the correct ones, but to say that if art would seek to leave the trap set by the conditions of contemporary art, then it might best proceed by inverting its dominant logic, such that one accesses the outside only by moving further inward in order to acknowledge the very structures that determine them, to play a part in the game that's playing us. And however esoteric Althusser's later writings might get, I think this is sort of his understanding of the efficacy of any possible counter-interpolation. And the primary reason for his remark in the Underground Current of the materialism of encounter, that weirdly assembled non-essay, that the world plays according to rules and it also plays with us, and there should be no mistake about that. Osborne, for his part, does give one, albeit canonical, example of a kind of functionalist work that sort of appreciates, I guess. And it's Gerard Richter's Atlas, which he says behaves as a structurally ambiguous cultural object through combining cultural, educational, exhibition value in a way that would be more than just a mere display of functionalism, for the reason that it indexes other works, other practices, other functions beyond the work of art that it is, even if for Osborne, it represents, as he puts it, a kind of moment of genuine openness to the world outside art. And the chapter where Osborne discusses functionalism and constructivism in relation to art and society is actually a really interesting one that maybe demands more attention, even though his own position sort of lapses into the conclusion that functionalist works, if there is such a thing as a functionalist work, it simply acquiesces to capitalist horizons of expectation. And he does cite the critic James Meyer, who sort of puts forward this idea that works take on a kind of communicational function across organizational relations, and the work becomes a function. It's embedded within the system of distribution and chains of meaning, which at this point have to also include digital networks as nodal points of contemporaneity. So if the work becomes a function, then you could also, I think, say that it becomes an interpolation, similar to what Bastiles was saying, maybe, since interpolation is itself a function. But here, Pace Reza, function is not tethered to constitution. It abstracts itself from the network that it's embedded in. So this is also why the possibility of counterinterpolation effectively sort of reverses an ideological grip, and it carves out as kind of like regional or local autonomy. So I mean, I think perhaps there's a kind of way to look at interpolation being grabbed this way, and as a sort of like enabling or generative entrenchment. That's like William Wimsatt's sort of idea of generative entrenchment, which Ben has also talked about, if not today, then elsewhere. And if as Ben also says, any object can become a platform, then we have to also assume that this holds for a work of art as well, potentially. I mean, it's sort of a provocation, because it should be asked if this can actually be retrieved as a kind of abstract capacity of art, like one that turns back against indetermination and a breakdown of categories so as to install a kind of pathogen within the logic of contemporary art's indeterminate sensual logic. So something that would be, trans-categorical and transmodern in the sense that Fernando Zalamea, for instance, attributes to it, rather than merely contemporary in the sense that both Suhal and Peter Osborne attribute to the contemporary. And so it's, it's kind of a question as to art's capacity to behave as like an alien material, and whether it can still establish enabling forms of alienation or cognitive estrangement. And if one of the functions of the work is to kind of a map across different functional regions, different functional practices, then by extension there's a retrieval of this idea of generalization, of generalization being a sort of power that's like distinct from the generic logic of indeterminacy, because generalization itself does not inherently imply indetermination, but instead it's something that sort of like mobilizes and gathers determination. And this would have to do with like it being a kind of property of manipulating concepts. So and with how a practice sort of like works with concepts for its own efficacy. And there's a kind of well-known formulation by Canguilhem here that to work a concept is to confer upon it the function of a form. It's to take it beyond its region of origin and generalize it. And similarly for Zalamea, generalization exists as a kind of weapon of contrast, sort of projecting abstract capacities. So but as Brassier put it in his last Bead interview, the audio interview that's available online, you can't simply use anything whatsoever to think about anything. There has to be some sort of specificity rather than an indetermination, rather than just juxtapositions or something. So for art, it's a matter of via rule, like how Brassier puts it, via rule-governed imposition of constraints, to forge new inferential connections in new perceptual modalities, rather than working with pre-established or pre-given inferences. But to do so, I mean, for an artistic practice to really begin to work with the rule-governed impositions of constraints, it demands theoretical construction, rather than simply experimental practices of negation or the posited supersession of existing logics or categories of art that would specifically negate theoretical construction. So it requires really rigorously thinking how we approach the work, what it's used to make it, how it's made in thought, how it's imbricated in different levels of mediation, conceptual and social, and the kind of intelligence that could be used to do so, I think, is best understood as metic. And it might be worth revisiting, artist Adrienne Piper's 1973 essay in support of meta-art, because there she proposes exactly this, that if as artists we sort of end up being sick to our stomachs with what happens to work in the circuits of discourse, and we have no one to blame but ourselves, right? And we should take the means of revelation into our own hands through this kind of secondary occupation of meta-art that would not itself be art, but nonetheless produces feedback and modification to that art by its very activation. So, while she claims that works of art are non-generalizable, non-functional, aesthetic rather than an epistemic object. So work is opaque, its making is opaque, you can't rationalize it, it's resistant, if not impervious to rationalization. And while I think this can kind of be argued against, I have agreement with her here when she says, quote, if we want to articulate anything, it must be by appeal to our epistemological abilities and not to the aesthetic experience, end quote. So, you know, the project of a sort of meta art or something becomes really about self-construction. She goes on to say, quote, the work per se is without pragmatic value, and this is as it should be. If we are going to justify the activity, it can't and shouldn't be by reference to the product of our labor, but to ourselves as conscious and responsible agents. It is not the art but our role as artists that needs analysis, end quote. You know, but this is all about sort of how we engage with our practices and our commitment to those practices. And in his Glass Bead interview, Brassier gives the example of musicians being kind of the ones who generally are, you know, familiar with engaging in this kind of thinking of sort of like rigorously considering the tools that get used, what and how, why they do what they do. And you know, there's an essay by Lyotard called Obedience, which is in The Inhuman, and it's sort of about this in a sense because it, you know, it's about the sort of freedom through determination of musical material. You know, and he sort of phrases it as like an absolute obedience of listening to listening. And you get the same sort of thing in Châtelet concerning learning. It's, you know, it's learning's obedience to learning. And for art, you know, this would require kind of crossing the strata of what are its obvious truths, you know. And this was sort of like the case with the, you know, the crisis of foundations in sciences, right? It had to cross the strata of its obvious truths. And so, you know, the same with the crisis of mediations in contemporary art. And while this is, you know, maybe just an analogy, it's like Lyotard sort of cites it, you know, in relation to music, because he insists that there isn't like actually an analogy to be thought on this point. And, you know, it's just in terms of, you know, crossing strata, like in order to cross any sort of territory, you have to learn how to navigate that territory. You have to sort of consider it as being sort of riddled with traps and opportunities, and traps which themselves can be manipulated into other opportunities. So escapology and navigation can't function without the idea of horizon, because this also sort of requires like what Althusser called theoretical vision. Navigation and escape do not negotiate in majority with necessarily empirical givens or established visibilities, but would instead to, you know, as Ben has already said, sort of seek the unseen within the scene. And I guess to just kind of like really finish up here and take Châtelet somewhat out of context, if contemporary art is iteration across mediations, as it says, then, you know, steal from Châtelet here, an iteration deprived of horizon must give up making use of the envelopment of things. It lapses into triviality, so it's mere juxtaposition. So it turns, you know, the horizon is what turns strata into a field of mobilities, into something that is transformative and can be transformed rather than a stable fixity or generic soup, which is really what contemporary art is, generic soup. So without the horizon, what is infinite becomes indefinite, you know, and therefore indeterminate, and learning becomes stifled. Thinking is immobilized, knowledge becomes static, art just becomes whatever. So that's kind of all I have to say as far as my presentation. Sorry, that was probably really long.
Okay, let me start, and then you let me know. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, thanks. That's a lot. I'll try and I haven't prepared such detailed notes, and I'll do partly I'll respond to what both Ben and Keith have said, and maybe do that by going to kind of, I think, what seems to be the central issue of why Keith has assembled us, which is to understand whether what I call the necessity of an exit from contemporary art can be squared with Ben's notion of general escapology. Firstly, just to reiterate what Keith said, I think there is a broad alignment between what we're doing. I see that alignment consisting primarily the notion that we don't, I don't think any of us assume or validate the notion of anarchic freedom as a condition of action, or what to do next, or how to deal with contemporary conditions and their problems. In a sense, there's an acceptance of being entrapped. The question is whether one can think of this entrapment positively, which I think Ben is trying to do, or negatively, which I think is the kind of general sort of morass of critical thought. Attached to this notion of anarchic freedom and its absence is, I think this may be more of a question for Keith, a question of whether we can assume autonomy or not as a starting point or condition for what we do within the trap. And this is something that I'll come back to later on. Maybe to situate the motivation for the term exit as what needs to happen in contemporary art. For me, the notions of escape are actually very prevalent and the common thing in contemporary art. In a way, what notions of critical art set up, what the kind of rampant subjectivism of contemporary art demonstrate, are kind of notions of sort of temporary or micro escapisms. This isn't Ben is in a way wanting to speak of general escapology rather than escapism, and I appreciate that difference. But it still seems to me that there's something within contemporary art which fits very well with the kind of notion of métis, which would construct this general escapology, what he calls a long con, which I think presents the problem of contemporary art as a kind of anarcho-realist operation. Just to go back to Ben's presentation, Ben, you were talking about how the notion of métis was castigated by Plato, I think you said in the Laws, as the operation that would sort of lead to political revolt, because people wouldn't know their proper place, and also would have the mechanisms by which to usurp their designated places as crafts or shopkeepers or whatever. That actually is exactly the same logic that Rancière mobilizes in his recent work on aesthetics, as why he would avow aesthetics as a kind of anti-systemic operation. It's also the modeling of the environment and the emphasis on error as a condition for, or as a schema in a way for thinking about escape, or rather of the trap, and therefore escape from the trap, seem to me kind of constitutive features of kind of general logic of contemporary art, and therefore I don't see a difference in that. Or let's put it the other way: I see contemporary art performing exactly what you're describing, or validating exactly what you're describing as a operation of métis. Again, in the notion of the weapon of the weak, or the emphasis on ambiguity, the contrast to instrumental reason, the emphasis on working in a way in the conditions that one has without broad systemic horizon, seem to me exemplary articulations of the kind of prevalent logic of critique, which is the operation of contemporary art claiming some sort of political validity and so on. So I don't see Matisse in itself as and therefore escape, if not escapology, as a sufficient term to deal with the problems of contemporary art, which Keith has outlined. I don't think I need to repeat. I mean, in a way, it's brought home for me biographically, in a way, by a colleague of mine at Goldsmiths, Edgar Schmitz, doing a course on escapology as in a way the civic virtue of contemporary art. The relative freedom, usually subjectively organized or critically organized, of artists, artworks, and so on, seem to me precisely efforts at providing provisional escapes from the entrapment of art and subjectivity by the conditions of contemporary societies, which are unless capitalism is the enemy, right? So I think for me, exit is a strategically useful term to distinguish what I think is necessary, which is a systemic effort to get out of the self-limitations of contemporary art against the very claims that it's trying to make, in order to distinguish it from what I see as a general escapism within art. Now, I appreciate again that you want to distinguish between escapism and general escapology. There's a question for me of if you want to talk about the long con against the contingent hustle, and I think it's a question that Keith brought up in his presentation. What's the horizon? What's the determining horizon of the long con? What's the end game? What's the thing you go with? What's the thing that you convince the other to give up despite themselves? And if that's not in place at the beginning, which is say the horizon isn't constructed at the beginning of the long con, I'm not sure that one isn't just producing iterations of hustles without closure, if you want. So I mean that's a little muddled as an articulation, but I think what's pressing the question is how to construct a generalized escapology, which is the long con, which requires some determination of what the con is for and what will be gained from it, in what circumstances, and despite those who are conned, if one doesn't have a horizon. But having that systemic horizon means that one's no longer doing Matisse in escaping the provisional trap that one is in. So that's a kind of I guess the mega question. I have some others or some kind of elaboration of this, but I don't know if we should just go straight into the discussion. I can flesh out the rest later. Ben's disappeared. Well, let me carry on for a bit while we get Ben back. Okay, so I think another way to articulate this problem of, let's say, local against systemic conditions would be a difference between strategy and tactic. And I can see Matisse being sort of tactical interventions on one's conditions. But the question is how to set up the strategy of the long con, or of generalized escapology. So in the piece, Maximum Jailbreak piece, if one's thinking about a cosmism to escape from gravity, that's a strategic undertaking. It's a huge, global, multi-generational strategic undertaking. It doesn't seem to me that the provisionality of Matisse could construct it. So for me, this kind of swings back to some of the issues that Keith was raising around institutionality. It seems to me that one name for structured long-term organization is, of course, the institution, which one can consider as a trap. Okay, I tend to, I affirm institutions. I think they're worth escaping from, in the sense of like a cunning intelligence as well. But precisely in order to build better traps, if you want, or better institutions. So my question would be, what, I guess specifically what, I appreciate this depends on different conditions and different traps that have been constructed. So maybe Keith's been speaking very effectively about the contemporary art problem, and this may not be Ben's particular concern or specific concern, but I think the issue would be how one could construct institutions that in a way validate and affirm metic intelligence without undoing the institution itself. I can't see how one could construct generalized escapology without some sort of long-term durable institution at work. But obviously one doesn't want to construct an institution that is simply entrapping rather than permitting what you're calling escape. But I think I'm uneasy around that term. So I'll stop there. I think we should probably just start talking to one another and have others.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, I'm afraid my phone crashed, so I missed the central and no doubt pivotal part of your reply. In terms of like generalized escapology, as it relates to kind of constructive behavior, I guess is no, I don't think this has got any. I mean, I have no particular interest or professional concern with or investment in, the condition of contemporary art. So I'm thinking about this from the perspective of design and strategy. I think undoubtedly there is a sort of fetishization of escape in general, but it seems to me I don't think there's that big a difference between oppositions really, because the sure, the contemporary art world, in what little exposure I have to it, is obsessed with these conditions and so on, but it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't work. The escape attempts do not escape anything. They are merely recovered. It seems to be the general condition. And specifically the idea that there is some kind of like generalized liberatory impetus to performing, I don't know, some kind of like participatory collective event through an installation or what have you, like how it's configured, isn't really particularly Matic at all. In fact, it's entirely sanctioned by existing institutions. It troubles no one. There is nothing kind of like particularly deviant to the kind of things that you're going to see if you go into the Tate Turbine Hall or something like that. This is how it appears to me, from kind of, I guess, the margins of this discourse. In terms of formulating Matis against a longer-term horizon, I think it's a mistake to think that everything works within, the structure of the long con, to think that everything necessarily works at the same scale. So the idea of the long con as a progressive increase in freedom and intelligence, in some sense, is that in escaping from one trap, you are delivered into other traps. You can kind of build a platform that allows you to confront that next sort of set of traps, and a new set of problems kind of arises and has to be dealt with, and then progressing through that, you get outside, but not to some kind of permanent outside, some always provisional and contingent and very limited outside. And in order to do that, sure, I mean, you need to construct some kinds of systems and structures that are more durable than others. I don't think that Matis is particularly restricted to being temporary and local on kind of like a human scale, if you see what I mean. It can certainly be applied to far longer and further reaching spatial and temporal factors. So the construction of institutions which enable you to use them as a platform in order to confront other things and so on, I don't see as being outside of that logic particularly. I think my concern with exit is that there is a kind of like permanence to it, and I mean certainly it's a word that's used a lot in libertarian circles, voice over exit, Albert Hirschman and people like that, and it implies that a kind of like general outside to which you exit, which is then completely unspecified. So I tend to prefer the language of kind of escapology and so on, in generalized escapology anyway, to make clear that this is a ongoing and difficult project. And one of the most difficult things about it is how do you actually know whether how do you know that it's working? I mean, this is surely the story of the rise and falls of civilizations. You get like a progressively more sophisticated institutional and socio-political structure, and this proceeds for a while, and then it begins to undo itself, and various kind of displaced externalities or contingencies begin to come back in, and eventually the whole thing gets overwhelmed. I don't think there's any, I think a knowledge of that or an acceptance of that is just prudent, basically. I mean, when I'm, especially in the maximum jailbreak piece, I'm talking about the history of large-scale socio-technical vectors, like escaping from the Earth's gravity well, and that kind of thing, which is of course decomposable into all kinds of barriers and all kinds of instances in which Metis needs to be applied. Sort of over time, which accumulate towards like a longer-term horizon. But I guess what I'm sort of rambling about is that that I don't see that as necessarily like a different kind of logic or requiring the insertion of some other, I don't even know what it would be, some other kind of intelligence or what have you. I don't know, it'd be good to hear from Keith on this though. Is there any Keith?
What's that? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just, I tend to, I sort of take sides with Ben on this, even though I also take sides with Suhail. It's sort of, but I mean, the bigger question for me is like, what is really, what's happening with art as a sort of like, a local abstract mode of thought. What does it do, and what are those sort of specificities, and why, why is it necessary to kind of, as an imperative to sort of remove it from the kinds of logics of contemporary art? Because it's basically it's for me it's a question of like art being a really effective way of thinking about things, or a way to sort of, through the manipulation of form and materials, to gain traction on other ways of thinking, be they philosophy or design or science, and this is something that I can only sort of index as being like it's true to my relationship to the game of like playing art and like being an artist and making things and thinking for a really long time about what it is that I do and how this sort of is embedded in other kinds of sort of disciplines and practices, and how that that kind of entanglement is really sort of necessary to sort of as a kind of tendency, if you like, to sort of to amplify within the practice of art, and how it needs to sort of be differentiated from the logics that contemporary art uses to sort of talk about itself and talk about what art is. And for me, that sort of it really pulls back to like really older definitions and relationships between art and design. So it's like I don't really necessarily see a huge difference between how something is fashioned, how you sort of like work with concepts and manipulate materials. Of course, I would agree with you, Ben, that like design does actually, it has more of a sort of protractive capability than art, but nonetheless, it's there's something specific to art, that I think needs to kind of be isolated and like kept and really affirmed outside of outside of the logic of contemporary art. So I mean, that's kind of my own sort of response there, and not. But then the question is, how do you do that? And Suhail would sort of suggest that you need to engage with systematicity or something, and so that's precisely what art does not do right now, as far as in as much as it goes by the name of contemporary art. If one sort of assumes their practice to be within contemporary art, if they are a contemporary artist, and they're sort of just basically like really allowing that sort of logic to sort of replicate itself without attempting to do much with it at all. So that's why for me, it's also a question of like being able to recognize that, and how something, and basically you have to escape art really to kind of construct some other way of thinking your way around that. So so basically like these questions, the efficacy of art cannot be answered for art in art by way of art. I think it sort of requires a different kind of thinking. So one has to escape being an artist in a sense. That's why.
Well, let me address that to both. I have echo on my mic. Keith, can you turn yours off? Okay, yeah, no, that helps. Okay, so it's a question I had to both of you in different ways. Just to come back to the point Keith was making just now, that in a way, people in contemporary art don't do much with it. It seems to me that actually what they are doing very effectively is something, insofar as the claims are being made around the work, is something that might actually be considered métis, right? This is kind of the uneasiness I have around the term, that in a way, if in its contemporary formation, I appreciate, Ben, that this isn't really your primary concern, but it's a concern Keith and I have, so put up with it for a minute. If in contemporary art the claim made is that here the artist demonstrates a kind of subjective viewpoint, which is like non-standard, or kind of a subjectively rich demonstration of a position, which is not the one conventionally interpolated, but a kind of self-interpolation or an alterity to it. That sounds to me like a version of Matisse without horizon, okay? Which is the concerns that you were raising, Keith, towards the end about an iteration without a horizon, as a kind of field of modalities I think you have. But the question I wanted to ask to both of you was in the notion of the trap and escaping the trap. I think, Ben, you said it explicitly, and it seemed to me implicit, Keith, in your comments about the kind of partial recovery of autonomy towards the end of your presentation. It seemed that both of you were suggesting that in order to deal with the trap, one has to see oneself from the outside. In a way, understand oneself both outside of the trap, i.e. you will get out of it, but also to understand oneself in the trap and therefore not simply contained within it, but to imagine how to deal with it from outside of your confinement, in a way, or in addition to your confinement. And so I was wondering whether either of you saw in that a kind of implicit claim for maybe autonomy, that whatever conditions one is in, the trap, there's still a kind of subjective access to the trap through which one can organize a route out of it, or can see how to get to the point out. But in addition to that, or kind of backed onto that question, is the I guess the inevitable question about whether one is talking about an escape to or an escape from. And it seems to me that one of the problems I have with the term escape is that it's defined in relationship to the conditions in which one is bound. Right? It's an escape from the trap. It doesn't articulate what the escape would be to. And to that extent, it seems to me that the formation of this problem of a release from given conditions, or an alteration, or I would say an exit from given conditions, seems organized too far, or organized reactively, let's say, rather than in terms of what the escape is for, not what the escape is from. So just to come back to Ben's response to my previous point, I appreciate that sort of articulating the difference between sort of long-term horizon and short-term horizon as one of duration versus locality isn't right. Clearly, one can think of long-term durational movements, durational efforts of cunning intelligence, and exiting the planet or leaving the planet would be one of them. But maybe the better articulation of the problem would be about a systemic endeavor against a reactive endeavor, right? A systemic notion of what you would call escape against a reactive one. And it seems to me that to pitch it systemically, which is I think the one that we have to face certainly in art, because the local ones will reiterate contemporary art, as both of you are saying. But also, if one is thinking about some larger global form of entrapment called capitalism or exploitation or whatever, some systemic account has to be built. And for that, reactive notions escaping from don't seem to me quite sufficient for the political horizon that's being claimed. I can't hear Ben. I don't know if Ben's responding.
I'm trying to
Yeah, there you are.
respond.
All right.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
got you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to claim any particular political horizon. Actually, it's sort of reiterated. I'm a designer and strategist, and I'm just kind of interested in the kind of intelligence that goes into constructing situations and so on. I think you're right. Sort of thinking back through what you were saying. Yeah, definitely there is a sense of distancing at work in the whole idea of freedom through alienation, as even on kind of like a local level. And it would seem to require, for it to be in any kind of deliberative way, certain capacities of modeling situations of what is getting called in psychology episodes of mental time travel, the entertainment of counterfactual situations, and this kind of thing. And I think that's rather the point about that sort of distanciation as it relates to the scope of escapes or exits, or however you want to phrase them. There's the thing about necessity being the mother of invention. It's kind of true, even if it does operate on the, I suppose, it occurs to me, it operates in the mode of matricide. But some necessities, things like a gravity well, are very, very difficult to escape from, require, as you say, multi-generational coordinated programs and this kind of thing. And that's not sort of the necessity, if one is distracted by immediate necessities like how to feed oneself or one's family and so on, then they are not, escaping from the Earth's gravity well is not going to be, foremost on the horizon, which is really kind of the extraordinary thing about Nikolai Fedorov's work in the late 1800s. Was decades before fixed wing flight, he was willing to entertain the possibilities of these kind of like enormous technical transformations. I would say that there's necessarily a kind of reactive dimension, as you say, but I would, to the idea of escape rather than exit, being based on finding a way out of local conditions without necessarily the specification of where you're going to. In terms of the modeling capacity that I was just talking about, well, that really is about the production of images of the future and where you're escaping to. But it seems to me that the proliferation of images of the future without any ability to escape from present conditions is kind of paradigmatically escapist.
I think we've had phone crash. Keith, do you want to take up the question while Ben comes back?
I'm sure he'll come back. It just has to sort of get his phone going again. But now might also be a good time to sort of like draw in some other questions, because a few of them have shown up from people who are watching. So we might want to do that. Still no Ben.
I have one mic on. Why is it like hello? Okay. As long as I don't get echo, I am, right, or no? Okay, so just a little clarification in the beginning. I'm interested in art as much as I'm interested in politics. And that doesn't mean I'm interested in political art, but because I think art and politics are related, despite truisms. But because I almost think that they're the same thing. Like two sides of the same coin, or maybe not even the same side of the same coin. And as a footnote, I want to add here that like this contemporary mode that we're either trying to escape or exit, a kind of like moment for it, for the ease of discussion, I would say we can put like a point for it, which is beginning of the fall of sort of like a place for me that like you notice contemporary art kind of like becoming aware of itself. And also, the next moment will be the arrival of the super contemporary art, which is really for me is in early 2000s and after 9/11. So where like fairs take over, biennales take over, and just like we enter this like double crazy moment. Now, originally, for me, art, or at least it was idealized, art had an anti-anthropic function to sort of like ensure that. Can you still hear me? Okay. It sort of like function in a way to sort of like against the entropy within sort of like social, economic, political systems, against its corruption, a place where public would not only escape from these systems, but also sort of like learn things and become cultured to make sure that these anthropic effects of civilization are prevented. But it seems like after the takeover of political systems in the Western world by neoliberalism, this anthropic system sort of like also got shifted over to neoliberalism. So rather than being an anthropic anti-system system for the public, it has become an anthropic system in which the system itself can ensure that it doesn't. It's not a major one, but it's one of the mechanisms through which the political system, now you can think of it globally or on a level of nation state or on a level of even a city that has art funding, or you can think of the state here as sort of like a combination of state and capital, or only state alone or capital. We'll leave it to you. That the system ensures that it does not fall apart or is not replaced. So art is deployed into this bigger ways of securing the existence of the system. Now, a precedent for that will be sort of like with Serge Guilbault's book, historically, how New York stole the idea of modern art. We saw clearly how USA deployed modern art in order to engage in Cold War against an enemy. But it seems like today, in which neoliberalism is kind of moving to its like barbaric, militarized phase on its external surface, art is deployed as a way of sort of like fighting the real ugliness of the system itself. So no longer we have this like Cold War in which we would like to deploy contemporary art to sort of like show that we're more civilized. We actually have to show our own self that we're more civilized. We have to fool ourselves with art that say we're not responsible for atrocities that are either directly or indirectly are part and parcel of our geopolitical economy. So this is sort of like how I look at how contemporary art function, beside how it's got its own economy and it's got its own way of sort of like the extension of market economy and speculation and money, which Sohail has brilliantly described in his work, including the one called Tainted Love, the essay called Tainted Love with Andrea Phillips. So this is why, to kind of like summarize it, because I think I took more than a minute, this is why I think, even though I agree with the general philosophical outlook of general escapology that Ben sets out, and I agree with him, I tend to, if it's about taking sides, I will have to, in the last instance, using some of like Althusser's terminology, side with Sohail, because I think Sohail's exit totally is about the exit also from this political debacle. So it's not just like an exit from contemporary art, but for someone like me, it's exit from the contemporary geopolitical reality, which to me, like I said in the beginning, is almost attached or same thing as contemporary art. So that was kind of like my 2 cents, and thank you for letting me participate. And also, by the way, Keith, your presentation was amazing. I think we should type it all up and sort of like have it as a text, because it was really wonderful. Or if you have the text, maybe we can somehow work on it or something. Anyways.
All right. Who wants to respond to that?
Well, I kind of think you should.
Why, me?
Yeah, you. I mean, partly just to go with Mo's kiss off. I'm quite eager to kind of not get into a Ben's side or my side sort of thing. I think the thing that what you've constructed well, Keith, is a sense in which we seem to be sort of talking about similar attempts to deal with current constraints, understanding these constraints are limiting and sort of inhibiting as well, necessarily. And we're trying to find a general method, I guess. I'm not quite sure what the right term is. An approach to kind of how do we go about changing where we are and what there is. Okay, so Ben is proposing genre escapology, and it seems that for him the term works well, given the difference between escapism and escapology. Whereas for me, I almost entirely agree, but given that the term exit for me is a very specific term to do with contemporary art, given the celebration of escape in contemporary art, but given also the way that escape falls back into precisely that which is complained about needs to be escaped from, reproducing, I think, what Ben is describing. Exit seems to me, and not just an exit from contemporary art, but an exit to another art than contemporary art. So it's a kind of located and specific use of the term exit, but I think broadly sympathetic with what Ben is describing. So all of that's a long elaboration to say Mo doesn't have to go in the last instance, because there isn't one between us. But I don't know if you want to deal with the issue of the political corollary of the art problem.
To what Mo was saying. What's that? Oh, okay. I feel like in order to kind of respond to what Mo was saying, I would need to go back and listen to that again, because he was like really choppy at the beginning, and I'm not sort of sure what what precisely the question was. I mean, if it was maybe about art that claims to be sort of political art and the kind of position that it has as a kind of like apologetics or something like that. Not, sort of. I would need to hear that again, and it's something that like I think it is an important problem, but I also there are sort of inherent problems in positioning yourself as a political artist. I mean, it's just kind of I think at this point sort of well known the kinds of non-productive complicities that sort of happen there. But in terms of maybe what you were just saying, because maybe the difference in terms, like, all right, okay, so the contemporary art world sort of it allows itself to be sort of metic, it's just escape all the time or something like that. But I still happen to see escapology as having a different kind of function than exit, even though what we're talking about is really the same function. I mean, it's an identification with the structure and sort of recognition of that structure, and then how you sort of remove yourself from it, but not just so that it's not just an exit or an escape from, but you're actually placing yourself in something different. Like, and it has to be something that is modeled. And it, it needs to be designed, and it's like a different art actually has to be sort of conceptualized. In terms of how to do that, well, that's kind of the question at the moment. It's a very real problem, and find sort of it's developing the techniques to sort of address that problem, right? To work with the problem, because if the problem sort of presents itself in this way, that's there's probably not an established set of tools to kind of work with the problem, because all of those established tools are are exactly what enables contemporary art to be precisely what it is. So that would just kind of be my response to that, without necessarily having an answer as to how to sort of enable that further at the moment. But there's actually kind of a lot of questions coming in from other people, and maybe we should try to get to those. Amanda's here. She might have, I think she has something to say.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Hello, everybody. I don't really have a really formulated question, which is why I felt unable to write it in the 242 characters that you're allowed. But I just also wanted to say thanks so much for the presentations, because they were incredibly thought-provoking and dense, and Keith, you brought up so many references and problems as well. And even though I don't want to deal with this one, I'm still reeling from Osborne's diagnosis of the function of art is anything it does outside of its idea of art, if you like, is the way you were describing it, which is a bit shocking to me, because I'm really interested in trying to think about how art functions as a modality that we can define through art and with art. And I guess I had a couple of questions. I mean, I had a first kind of worry about Ben's description of general escapology, and I was a bit worried about it because I was thinking that how does it kind of get out of the problem of idealizing escape as a kind of normative process, in the sense that life becomes a series of constant escapes, and so we live in this emancipatory procedure. But I guess this might reflect on Suhail's question in some sense as well, but I wondered how that consciousness of constraint, which is central to the metis, the cunning that's required, or the skill to escape from traps, part of the condition of producing other forms with direction. So I guess my question is what is the role of consciousness in the sense of the consciousness that would allow the metis, in fact, or be wrapped up within it? Because one needs to, it seems to me that one needs to be conscious of the trap itself before one would begin to work one's way through it and out of it, or even be able to produce new ones. One needs to know about the trap first of all, or have some cognizant idea of traps. And I'm wondering what the role of that cognition is, and how, as I say, how it how that problem is escaping itself being related to the unconscious production of other traps. Like, how can we have a conscious production related to that conscious realization? Is there a relation there at all? I'm just wondering about that, because I couldn't really understand how that operated. And then Keith, I have a quick kind of question about your use of the word artificiality. You were kind of working through Althusser, and I can see why you're using the term artificiality when you look at the vista of contemporary art, because, you know, Althusser didn't consider it, especially in the SBS, he wasn't considering art something that could ever purchase the kind of scientific knowledge that philosophy operates with. He was very against the kind of humanities in that respect. But I'm all for rescuing the kind of procedures of art here in this kind of territory. And I wonder if the kind of what is the set of distinctions we make between the vista of contemporary art that prohibits the horizons that you seek, and I also seek actually, and the idea of another art that can be a universal address. And if the distinction between those two forms is one is artificial and one is real, then I'm concerned about the hierarchy, the kind of structural hierarchy that we're employing to make these distinctions in the first place. I'm interested in Althusser because although he kind of infers that kind of distinction, he also employs another one which I find more useful, which is the distinction between contradiction and non-contradiction, or the distinction between correct and incorrect logic systems. And I wondered if you could just say something a bit more about why it's useful to call the condition of contemporary art artificial, when of course, whilst we might not like it and find it problematic in so many ways through systems of logic or realism or so on, we're still relying on it and we're still within it. So is it wise to kind of articulate a politics that actually comes from the level of the unreal or the artificial, something that we don't trust, let's say, or see as real? And for me, that might end up just in a form of irony. Okay, so they're my questions. Thanks.
Okay, so that was a sort of complex set of questions, and I think there was maybe some in there for Ben as well, so maybe he can also sort of address that. But I think, you know, with Althusser, there's a really good essay by one of the editors of his posthumous works, Francois Matheron, who just entitled "The Impure Purity of the Concept," which I think specifically addresses this. His claim is that Althusser always wrote from within the dimensions of the impure, and so you basically have on the one side the real, and on the other side the artificial, i.e. The purity of instrumental rationality in the construction and designing of concepts and sort of theoretical machines and tools and devices for for analysis, and on the other there's the more sort of a given relationship with the world, inhabiting in terms of like vision and sense perception, and like sort of what just kind of strictly appears to us just on a kind of like everyday sort of level. And maybe this is something that can also be brought into kind of the current discussions about Wilfrid Sellars and the manifest image versus a scientific image of man, etc. But the point with Althusser is that really, to make the claim for an affirmation of the purity of conceptual construction or scientific discourse and scientific methods and techniques is not a negation of this other end of things, which we sort of think as being more real. It's a way to sort of really like update and revise them. So there's a kind of what I see in Althusser based on my reading, like according to Metis, is really a sort of alignment with a lot of what's going on in the neo-rationalist project of Reza, for instance. Even though there's very, very many distinctions that can be drawn there, but it just in terms of like that particular sort of way of addressing artifice, where it's sort of the conscious way of inhabiting a trap, or inhabiting the interiority of one's determinations, structural determinations, is kind of it's to recognize that is a way you have to sort of design and model the kind of the artificial behaviors of those methods of entrapment themselves in order to sort of move out of them. And maybe this goes into the question that you were kind of asking Ben about how these sorts of procedures kind of, like at the same time as you model a way out, you also model some, the conscious modeling of an escape or an exit, or however you want to sort of phrase it there, kind of also models like an unconscious. And I think that this is something that can't really be avoided. Just it's kind of a structural condition in order to sort of, to intervene within a field of visibilities, so an epistemic landscape, to sort of invest it with the kind of horizon and sort of mobilize thought among that territory. It operates on a redistribution of what's visible and invisible within that very structure. So you sort of it is a reproduction of the the operations that are already performed within that structure. So so I think that's unavoidable, but it's a matter of sort of really determining which visibilities need to be kind of amplified in order for a situation to kind of be more efficacious, as it were. And maybe on that note, I can kind of hand it over to Ben.
No? No. Can anyone indicate whether they can hear me? Yep. Okay. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm not getting any feedback on my phone that's telling me that anyone can hear me. Okay. So yeah, I mean, to kind of extend what Keith said. I mean, any constructive project is going to precipitate various, by affecting some kind of systemical change in the functions of an environment is going to have knock-on consequences which can't, well, I suppose it's a matter of philosophical debate how far those things can be foreseen and what the status of absolute contingency is with regard to that and so on, which I'm aware I've only got a few minutes, so I'm not going to get into that. But absolutely, the kinds of projects, or the kind of what Detian and Vallon call spirit of approach, which is represented by Metis, with a particular sensibility, yeah, absolutely precipitates kind of further consequences which themselves can be deleterious to one's initial project or return in some way as negative conditions in the future. And I think, as Keith was saying, like part of sort of adopting this particular sensibility or disposition is acknowledging that that is in fact the case, and that you escape from a trap, which is quite a sensitive procedure, and you are free of the trap, but that you are delivered into other ones, not least by the changes you're affecting yourself to overcome that initial trap. And that there's, so imminent to this logic, there's the idea that that there is no finish, there is no kind of finish line which you ultimately run over, and then everything's fine from that point on. But you're always producing further consequences, being delivered into environments that need a perpetuation of this logic in order to be prospered in. I don't see that as a bad thing at all necessarily. It implies the development of an intelligence that it is kind of vigilant, plastic, and highly capable, robust, and so on, in order to be able to continue to maneuver despite the unintended effects of early action. But just in general, with regards to the kind of normative element of escape, I think that there needs to be a recognition that the trap and the escape exhibit a curious reversibility, in that one escapes a trap by effectively adopting another trap, by contouring one's behavior, by making a commitment, as Reza would put it, in a kind of Brandomian register. And so it's not just a pure project of escape that kind of like is thought to be massively inflationary, without any any problems arising along the way, but rather kind of the progressive deployment of traps as a means to escape is part of this kind of circulating logic, which is not an iteration, I don't think. It's to riff off the Chatelet thing, I mean, it is the introduction of a horizon. It's directional. It's a vector rather than just an iteration, which implies doing exactly the same procedure again and again. But I'm aware we're kind of out of time, so does anyone else have anything to add? Is anyone else even there?
Hello?
Hello.
Can anybody hear me? Sorry. Yeah, I think there's a couple earlier questions that were asked over online, so I'm just going to probably kind of try and jump in here and see if I can get a few of those in. In particular, from Victoria Ivanova, which I don't think that's her actual last name. I think it's a pseudonym, but
Joshua? Joshua?
I think Joshua disappeared. He was trying to ask someone's question, but I'm not sure where he posted them. I don't see them. Okay. Maybe this one was for Suhail. I guess I can ask it. It's from Victoria. Regarding the demand to have systematically organized horizons as a way of dealing with the entrapment of present conditions, I wonder how would those horizons be structured? Aren't we here dealing with a problematic confrontation between epistemological approximation, qua propositions, and givenness as that which ultimately escapes propositional thinking? Can't hear Suhail.
If people could mute and unmute themselves, it would help greatly. Obviously, I will try to help with that, but everybody needs to, pay attention to their own panel too.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Sorry about that.
Okay, good. All right. That's fine. So I don't quite understand the givenness of. I'm just find the quote again. The givenness of that which ultimately escapes propositional thinking, which is the last clause of Victoria's sentence. But if it's a difference between epistemology, knowledge, thinking, and the real, which is outside of that stuff, and therefore propositional, I'd be against the general thrust of the question. It seems somewhat Wittgensteinian to me that the real somehow escapes thought. Sort of, since I'm part of this commitment to rationality, newfound commitment to rationality, it seems to me that the given or the real can be propositionally thought. But I think core to Victoria's question, maybe more general, is the task of modeling. In a sense, if Amanda was asking about the cognition of one's circumstances as a trap, the question is how does one model does one model real or one circumstances, and for that, I don't see that's necessarily just propositional thinking. I don't see it's necessarily just epistemological. Of course, images and sounds and the organization of that stuff as artwork can help capture a sense of where one is, but that capturing isn't neutral. It's a model, and it's perspectival, but it's also motivated, and of course it can also be rational. So I don't see a necessary contradiction between setting up the either short-term or long-term horizon. I don't see an essential difference between in the task of understanding or comprehending one's circumstances as enclosed, let's say, or a trap. I guess you could ask the question the other way, which is how would an animal understand itself to be trapped if it can't produce propositional statements? Right? There's some sense in Ben's model that the trap extends from, and also the escape from the trap extends from animals who try and get out of traps to humans who produce them and try and get out of them themselves. It's possible to model the sense of a trap without propositional claims, I think. And in fact, I think the trap might be a useful way of thinking about multiplicity of ways of modeling conditions. That's that. Should we deal with some of the other questions too? Okay, there was two for Ben. Do you want to take them up, Keith?
From what should I ask Ben's question? The questions to Ben, is that the request? Okay, question.
Yeah, I can't see any questions.
You can see them. Okay.
So good help. Good help.
All right. So Holly Butler says, "Hi Ben, broad question. Considering this conception of freedom as a stepwise escape from traps, what do you see as first-order traps for left accelerationists concerned with a project of global emancipation or others who pursue this project?" Another question for Ben from Victoria Ivanova. If Metis is... Oh, where did it go? Okay, if Metis is contingent on the particularities of a given trap situation, how is Metis to be reconciled with the need to think and act systematically as demanded by accelerationism rather than locally?
Sorry, can you repeat that second one? I didn't catch it.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Hey.
Okay, so question from Victoria Ivanova. If Metis is contingent on the particularities of a given trap situation, how is Metis to be reconciled with the need to think and act systematically as demanded by accelerationism rather than locally?
Okay. Well, in terms of first question first order traps, from the perspective of left accelerationism, I suggest you take that up with the sort of Srnicek-Williams axis, because that's really their ground. I think that it would seem apparent. So I'm sympathetic to the project, and I think there's a lot of compatibilities with it, but I think at the same time I'm not really placed to say what how they would configure it within a kind of left accelerationist dynamic. It would seem obvious that there are multiple of entry to any of this. I mean, we're not. I don't think there's a kind of like clear way to articulate sort of like a first which would necessarily Okay. I think that within a kind of accelerationist dynamic, you would be hard pressed to kind of linearize everything, given sort of systemic interdependencies and that kind of thing. So I would imagine there's a whole suite of different traps that would need to be dealt with, which would have to be addressed by what Nick and Alex in the Accelerationist Manifesto refer to as an ecology of institutions, each of which would be effectively operating to build platforms to address particular kind of local circumstances, but potentially with broader reach that was scalable in some kind of way, and so on. I mean, in terms of first-order traps, there's the kind of like contingencies on which we are, on which various social structures are built are many and various. There's sort of multiple roots or foundations to like any given kind of contemporary situation. I think Keith mentioned before William Winsat's work, which I think is absolutely kind of integral to looking at these kinds of things. So particularly Winsat's idea of generative entrenchment, which is really a response to the question of how agencies become nested. So there's some evolution is full of examples of this, where there is some kind of minor mutation or what have you, which perhaps in and of itself does not actually mean that much, but it becomes a platform that other things are built on top of, and therefore there's a relationship of dependency which is kind of like fostered by that situation. And this means that eventually you have to get into a situation where you understand a lot of things which are the targets of critique, traditionally, or sort of archetypally capitalism, when you say, well, this is actually a very deeply, something like exchange of equivalent commodities and the equivalence of their value as rendered thereby is an enormously powerful generative platform that is deeply entrenched and cannot simply be kind of unpicked piecemeal in such a way that it can't be evaporated, basically, that it would necessarily require sort of multiple angles of attack and all kinds of different systems, some of which would fail, some of which would others, to provide alternatives to that system, perhaps in a local way, but as I say, kind of being sort of palimpsested or treated as some kind of sheaf or what have you, that would affect a broader transition to post-capitalism, as Nick and Alex speak about it. I think the question, I mean, obviously this relates as well to the second question about Metis being kind of like local, provisional, contingent on circumstances, and how that can kind of be generalized. This is actually, interestingly, this is a question which was one of the reasons, or at least in Lisa Rafal's work on ancient Greek and ancient Chinese thought, Metis and its various equivalents in China, which attempted to address a similar complex of kind of cunning intelligence and its activities, where one of the reasons why Metis or cunning, or however you want to put it, was not well treated in the Western tradition was precisely because it was so bound up with specific circumstances, such that it's easy to point at examples of Metis as forms of cunning ingenuity and particular escapes and so on, but there can be no kind of like Platonic archetypal instance of Metis. How far that logic is really true, I don't know, because I think you can articulate Metis not as just a spirit of reproach, but as identifiable by certain particular patterns, like you can sort of define it as intelligence which is made visible when extraordinary effects are elicited from unpromising materials and so on. Hazy as that is, it nonetheless, it is some kind of definition. But in terms of the kind of sort of systematizing it again within a left accelerationist project, really literally globalizing it, putting it on a geopolitical scale. I don't know how it would work specifically, so I'm just dealing with spiders. But I think that what it does offer is a kind of shift in perspective away from previous patterns of thinking about constructive activity as something which is the application of theory. I think that's one of the key issues in the philosophy of technology, especially within the Western tradition, is this idea that you come up with a view of how you want the world to be, you then try to affect it, and you judge your success by the degree to which your efforts approximate that original position. Whereas Metis offers instead a more kind of exploratory, manipulative, provisional, and I suppose consistent point of view on the nature of constructive activity itself, such that if our constructive activity has to pass by way of ingenuity, you will necessarily, it is a wiser and more prudent thing to do to look at what are the potentials actually available within specific situations and how they can be elaborated, rather than trying to predefine exactly how you want the world to be and bracketing the logic by which you will actually try and bring that about, if that's clear. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to this. I'm afraid I need to shoot off fairly quickly, but maybe time for another couple of questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? Yes. Okay. Well, I think that there's a question from, yes, over there. Okay. Somebody else wants to ask a question, so I'm going to mute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, you can hear us great. Okay. I'll be really quick. Thanks everyone. It's been really good. There's lots that I could say, but I just have a really quick question, which is that I was thinking that escape entails a kind of anxious relation between the trapper and the trappee, and in this relation there's a necessity for both the trapper and the trappee, in that the first must trap and the latter must escape. Whereas in exit, however, the decision to exit is based on perhaps at best an ambivalent relation or an arbitrary relation. And I was thinking this arbitrariness is probably some kind of positive vector of change. But I wondered if Suhail or Ben, well, or any three of you, including Keith, could maybe say something about the question of necessity and arbitrariness in either escape or exit or both.
Yes, I think for me, exit speaks to more purposeful repudiation than escape. Escape works well, I think, to describe. Elements can escape from the system. Gases can escape from a room without necessarily some notion of organization and systemic endeavor. And I think that also carries through for the reasons Ben's just articulated around Metis. And I think that this is the kind of core contention, I think, between us. And I think for me the contention arises because in contemporary art, as a kind of asystemic endeavor or asystemic field, and one that avows its asystematicity, the notion of escape kind of falls very easily back into it. Precisely as the kind of vector of the non-systemic or the attempt to get out of system, and the thing that interests me around the term exit is that one has to think comprehensively about the conditions that one is in. A theoretical articulation is needed, I think, to understand the non-local element of one's conditions, and then a strategy is needed in order to kind of exit rather than escape, which one can do accidentally, right? One can find oneself out of a trap without necessarily meaning to get out of it because it catches you by surprise. I mean, I appreciate that element of it, which I think Ben is stressing up, but certainly in relationship to the art field, I think purposeful, comprehensive repudiation of the contemporary art paradigm is itself not a contemporary art move. And that's why I think exit is the right move in relationship to art. So, I mean, maybe also that means, in the terms you're setting up, that one posits oneself as having a non-essential relationship or a non-necessary relationship to the field in which one is core. And in that, there's an enactment of freedom, or freedom by distance, which is what Ben was summoning earlier as the kind of condition of escape. So that might be a point of convergence between the two theorizations that we have.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's important, I mean, you know, to discriminate semantically and conceptually between escape and exit as they're being used here, but it's also important just to see the general commonality of the two things, or you know, of the sort of like meta principle which is underlying both of them. I mean, for me personally, one of my issues with exit, and I really appreciate Suhail's sort of designation of it as kind of systemic, comprehensive, and repudiatory. I think, though, that exit does not, to me, connote a specifically constructive project in the way that escape does. I mean, escape immediately implies that you are, in every sense, in media res, and that an active effort must be made to disentangle yourself from even, you know, well, from the kind of infiltration of the situation kind of into yourself, basically, in the ways in which you're kind of bound to it, and the unpicking of that. Whereas to me, exit, yeah, I appreciate this particular use of it, but doesn't imply that kind of direct relation to kind of like a constructive act. So I mean, I think, to throw sort of similar example back at you, Suhail, so you can, I guess you can say that you can escape by accident, although any interesting situation to escape from that's probably not the case. A gravity well, for instance. But then equally, you know, you can exit just by walking out of a room. And so I think there's probably like a tension there between those, sort of the applications of those. As to the question about arbitrariness, I'm not sure I have really anything to add. I don't know if Keith wants to chip in on that, though.
If I wanted to chip in on what? It was the last. What was the last portion of that? Yeah, I don't know. Mo's kind of been bugging me actually to
just chip in generally.
Just chip in generally, sure. Mo's kind of been bugging me to respond to his question, which I didn't hear because it was sort of you know, the mic kept cutting out, and I kind of want to like reread what he said there. So he says, I never said I like political art. Instead, I propose all art is always already political, is already politics, not political. Even when it tries not to represent anything, like in the case of abstract expressionism. So art cannot be separated from the problem of our existing politics. If we try to escape contemporary art system, we are still in the prison of our political system. Any attempt to reform art and its institutions under our current political system only strengthen the mask or the camouflage with which, uses art to hide its barbaric features, usually shown in ways that neoliberalism escapes its power outside of its main geopolitical domain, like nation-state, from itself and populations who support and own it through their democratic participation. The exit from contemporary art can only really take place if it simultaneously involves an exit from our current geopolitical system. In the meantime, art can either use its agency to tear down the mask to show the barbarians hidden behind art with their political and financial support, or art in neoliberal states. And I don't know, it's a complex set of questions embedded in one thing that's supposedly one question, and I would just say that I kind of agree with what Mo's saying, in the sense of you're not going to sort of leave the situation of contemporary art unless the geopolitical system itself is somehow modified, right? But this is a question, go back to something like Ray's critique of the art world, saying, well, it's not a system, you can't manipulate it. However, if you change if you change what the art world is sort of attached to as a sort of parasite on the actual system of the geopolitical system, then that's sort of the non-system that the art world is actually modifies and can somehow integrate itself within within a system, and that's maybe the horizon that I would just sort of agree with Mo on that point. But I don't know what to say about his other, art is already politics, sure. This was one of Felix Gonzalez Torres's an old interview that I always remember him saying that, it's a Helen Frankenthaler color-field painting. It's just a sort of it's a camouflage sort of excuse for neoliberal practices and neoliberal politics, the most conservative sort of kinds of politics. And sure, that's I'm not going to disagree with that. The problem is it's sort of isolating what are we going to do with art? How to construct another art that isn't going to be that, right? That isn't going to be that. It has levels of complicity, as every kind of practice has to have complicities, but what are those complicities going to be? What sort of tendencies are they going to align themselves with? And those things have to be determined and really thought and worked out through practice. So it's nothing that I have an answer for. It's something that I'm continuing to think about. So that's my only sort of response to Mo's provocation.
There was one question from Robin for me, I think, which was whether Robin asked me if I was affirming Stanley Fischer's position, if I think I'm escaping the institution. Biographically, clearly not the case. Are you really, because escaping the institution only ever contributes to its renewal without appeal and remainder. And I think this may come back to some of the comments I made earlier about traps, institutions being traps, thought affirmatively in the way that Ben is suggesting. I certainly wouldn't suggest a kind of extra institutional, an exit to a non-institutional condition. My sense is rather that if one reconfigures institutions as traps in the way Ben is suggesting, institutions become conditions for escape from the current situation, right? But that requires. I think what's interesting about Ben's proposal for me is I appreciate the escape angle. I think in a way that's the easy to appreciate angle, certainly from the art field. The hard angle to appreciate is actually the affirmation of traps as kind of setting up conditions for implementation of another intelligence, or kind of new moments of intelligence, which hasn't previously been available or needed because one hasn't answered oneself to be in a trap. Right. So my sense is that the institutions can grow in ways that are better, rather than what seems a current decline in institutions, certainly of education, generally speaking. That institutions can grow precisely through a metic operation on current institutions, right? But again, it's important that I think what's common between Ben and me is that neither of us is suggesting that one escapes out of the trap or out of traps, in this case institutions altogether, or exits from institutions altogether, right? Which is what I think is common in art, contemporary art, as the kind of anarcho-realist maxim, that somehow the truth of art lies outside of its institutionality or then its artificiality. So for me, it's an important it's important, especially given the current sort of skepticism and despair around institutional life, that there is a continued affirmation of institutions as sort of transgenerational moments of transgenerational invention. But one has to understand institutions and also organize them, necessarily organize them as places that validate and support the generation of métis around themselves as well as externally.
I think, especially as it's become wedded to some kind of neo-rationalist project, is the articulation of kind of macro-cognitive systems that aren't the ones that we already have, which is a project of kind of institutional renewal of some kind. And this, yeah, I think there are some issues there around things like the market, for instance. I mean, you know, I've always been quite fond of Hayek's description of the market as a kind of like distributed coordination system for the application of practical intelligence, which I mean is problematic, but at the same time it's like, well, there's, you know, that is a sort of function of, you know, price mechanisms and so on, and there's surprisingly little work on that kind of thing. I mean, there's a guy called Bryce Huebner, I think you say his name, wrote a book recently called Macrocognition, which is fascinating in this regard. But this seems to be kind of like one of the paramount kind of institutional issues, is like, how do you actually build a kind of intelligence system which coordinates the efforts of a lot of individual human beings and so on, if like in a radically different way. And I think that also relates to a problem with kind of the sort of what geopolitical program sort of associated with kind of like Metis or what have you, sort of actually rendering that, is that Metis is very much the operations of intelligence on frontier, even if that frontier may be very abstract. I mean, you know, not to keep reusing the same example, but things like gravity well, you know, understood as a kind of frontier. I mean, a fairly quiet frontier that is, you know, sort of omnipresent and extremely abstract, but nonetheless a frontier. And one of the issues with new institutional development is that, you know, different forms of institutional format are good at different things, which I think is put extremely well by a guy called John Carter McKnight when he was talking at the British Interplanetary Society the other day, when he was asking the question of whether his first slide was just a question saying, you know, is a society capable of building settlements on Mars also capable of thriving in them? And I think that's the kind of like thorny situation that that extends to this project of institutional renewal, where in fact, you know, there are sort of like different logics which are suited to different environments, and institutions are structured in very different ways. And to, you know, sort of happily sort of say like, well, you know, you need some new institutions that are capable of doing various things. It's like, well, yes, but they need to be designed, and there's a whole range of institutional models there already, and they need to be kind of like actively addressed and understood and potentially reconfigured or reformatted. So I'm not really sure where I'm going with this. I'm just sort of making the point about institutions. How that relates to contemporary art, though, I mean, is, I guess, kind of beyond my purview, so I will happily turn that over to someone else.
Yeah, I don't know that I really have a response to that. Yeah, I'm sort of I'm a bit brain dead at this point. From being kind of up for so long. I don't know. It's, yeah, maybe beyond your purview, but the sort of like the answers to that kind of construction, they don't really. They're just things that are a part of like what I'm in the process of sort of like dealing with and thinking about now, and like the sort of you know, the necessity to sort of kind of really address that. You know, you have to move through some kind of successive layers of, you know, all these mediations to sort of address the, you know, what are the logics of contemporary art, and like how do you sort of think your engagement with the structure. And I think these are just sort of things that are part of, you know, my commitment to my practice is sort of like work through them, and how those sort of like ramify the, you know, the practice itself. But other, you know, the sort of like broader scope of those kinds of transformations isn't like, you know, there's nothing that I have in terms of that. It's a question for design, Ben, not for art.
Well, trade on that note.
I'm sorry. Do you want to go ahead, Ben, or?
Just to be clear, the echoing is coming in when somebody else is speaking and Keith's mic is on, but I just muted him, so go ahead. Joshua, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, I think Ben's mic is still on. No, actually, it was kind of, this is sort of more of a question for Keith, and it's probably a very large one, so I don't know that we'll necessarily have time to address it, but I guess it's more of something to ask. It's like a starting point, but it's more kind of along the terms of, well, he mentioned the sort of domain specificity or the type of practice that is art, and I guess I'm wondering if he has any particular parameters that he's examining for what that might be, and I think maybe that would begin to shape this question of what sorts of institutions would be required to address, you know, this particular kind of practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what, I mean, it was a question about the domain specificity of art, right? And what kinds of, well, I mean, that's the problem, right? What is the domain specificity of art? Because, well, you can isolate it as a specific sort of mode of thinking, but it nonetheless, as any sort of mode of thinking has its own domain, they nonetheless sort of, you know, they share neighborhoods. There's always overlap. You know, I mean, you can't say that a kind of, you know, that it's sort of the construction of a scientific theory is not political. I mean, there's definitely politics in that. I mean, especially if you look at the, you know, the kind of like the early attempts to sort of create the set theoretic sort of foundation for mathematics, or, you know, the Bourbaki group, etc. You know, even someone like Grothendieck. So, and, you know, and there's political procedures that have to sort of involve more sort of creative kinds of endeavors or something that would sort of rely on techniques which you might sort of associate with art or design or something like that. So I'm not so sure about like how to kind of approach this with idea about domain specificity yet, because I'm not sure I understand like exactly what you're asking with that, or what sorts of institutions would enable. But yeah, but maybe that was sort of an answer to your question, or an escape from it. I don't know.
You know, it's kind of a formalization. Then, I mean, is there a kind of specific mode in which art is interacting with, I don't know, the real, maybe you would say, and that it manipulates that?
Well, okay, sure. But okay, what do you mean by the real, and like how? I don't think that there's any sort of mode of thinking that does not interact with the real and manipulate it. But the way that happens is through you know, it's artificial construction, right? In relation to that real. You know, and it has to, you know, the methods of formalization that get used have to sort of behave according to the rules that are set up based on that situation, that whatever that sort of that specific domain happens to be, or that, you know, that specific situation, that specific structural determination or something like that. But without staying there, right? The idea is not to not stay there. It's to move to another sort of determination, another kind of domain. That's kind of all I have to say for that. Okay, so I guess we'll just wrap up with that. I want to really thank everyone for their really thought-provoking questions and presentations, and to all involved, Ben and Suhail, Josh, Mo, Diane, Jason Adams for really helping us out with the tech. Yeah, this was really fun and great, and my head hurts a little bit. So it's going to be good to have a break from this. Thank you and goodbye.